In the stillness before dawn, long before Memphis began to stir, a single sound cut through the quiet corridors of Methodist Hospital, the soft shuffle of shoes approaching a door that should have remained closed a little longer. Elvis Presley, exhausted from 2 days without real sleep, lay half awake on a narrow cot pushed against the wall. His body was here. His heart was down the hall. He didn't know it yet, but the next 10 seconds would become the moment he replayed more than any song he'd ever recorded. The door cracked open. A strip of hallway light sliced across the room, and the expression on the nurse's face, the way her mouth tightened before she spoke, the way she hesitated, as if hoping for a miracle to appear behind her, told Elvis everything before she even opened her lips. "Son, you need to come with me." That was all, 7 words, softly delivered, almost tender, but they hit like a hammer. Elvis stood too quickly, like a man trying to outrun his own heartbeat. His chest tightened, his stomach clenched. He followed her without breathing, without blinking, without understanding how the world could still be turning. A strange calm filled the hallway, a kind of suspended silence that felt unnatural, like the world had paused out of respect. The closer he walked toward room 107, the thicker the air became. Every step felt heavier, like the floor wanted to hold him back, to warn him that once he crossed the threshold, there would be no going back. Vernon Presley stood just outside the doorway. His hands trembled. His eyes were red, the kind of red that comes from a kind of pain you can't disguise. He tried to speak, but the words broke apart in his throat. He didn't have to finish the sentence. Elvis knew. Still, he pushed past him. Still, he clung to the impossible hope that maybe this was something else. A scare, a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything but what he felt deep in his bones. But the moment he stepped inside, the truth was waiting. The machines were quiet, the room was too still, and his mother, Gladys Love Presley, the woman who had been his anchor since the cradle, the only person who knew the boy beneath the legend, lay motionless. Gone. For a long time, Elvis did not move. He didn't cry, he didn't collapse, he didn't speak. He simply stared, as if staring could undo reality, as if the force of his longing could pull her back into this world. But death does not negotiate. Not even with the king. When the tears finally came, they came in soundless waves. He sank to the side of the bed, took her hand, and whispered her name through a voice that barely existed. And then came the sentence, the quiet confession he would never repeat publicly. A sentence so private, so raw, so revealing, that only 2 people alive ever heard it. A sentence that explained the depth of their bond and the depth of his devastation. A sentence that would shape the man he became for the rest of his life. But that sentence is not for this moment. Because to understand the words Elvis whispered to his mother, you must first understand everything that led him into that room. Everything that happened in those 72 hours. Everything he feared, everything he blamed himself for, and everything he realized too late. This is the story of the week that broke him, and of the night that changed Elvis forever. It began quietly, the kind of quiet that hides danger behind ordinary moments. A warm August wind moved through Memphis, carrying nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Life went on as it always had. People bought groceries, neighbors sat on porches, radios played Elvis's latest hits. No one suspected that inside the Presley home, the foundation of Elvis's world had already begun to crack. On Friday, August 8, 1958, Gladys Presley returned from a trip feeling tired, feverish, a little shaky on her feet. She brushed it off at first, just a little bug, she told Vernon, but her steps were slower, her breathing heavier, her face paler than usual. By that evening, the worry in Vernon's eyes had grown too large to hide. He insisted she go to the hospital. Gladys, never one to complain, reluctantly agreed. Methodist Hospital didn't feel like a place for someone like her, a woman who had fought through poverty, raised a son with nothing but faith and grit, and expected no luxury from life. Yet here she was, lying in a white room under bright lights, doctors murmuring terms that sounded heavier each time they repeated them. Acute hepatitis, complications, elevated fever. Words that carried weight, even if she tried to pretend they didn't. But the truth she never said out loud, was that she had been tired long before this week. The world had been pulling at her son from every direction, and every inch he was pulled away from her felt like another thread snapping inside her chest. Fame had brought joy, yes, but it had also brought a quiet fear she could never fully silence. And now she was lying in a hospital bed, while her boy was hundreds of miles away in Fort Hood, serving his country, trying to juggle duty and devotion. Vernon notified the army immediately. Elvis deserved to know. And he deserved the chance to say goodbye if it came to that. But Elvis didn't grasp the gravity yet. When the call reached Fort Hood, he felt the first tremor of dread. Still, he told himself not to panic. "Mama's strong," he repeated. "Mama will be okay." After all, she had survived poverty, hunger, grief, uncertainty, everything life had thrown at her. Surely she would survive this. The army granted him emergency leave at once. Not because he was famous, but because families mattered and illness didn't care about rank. Elvis packed in a blur. He didn't pack clothes. He packed memories. He packed fear he refused to name. And on that long drive toward Memphis, the world outside the car window seemed like it belonged to someone else. He gripped the steering wheel and prayed under his breath, the same whispered prayers his mother had taught him in that tiny Tupelo house decades earlier. "Lord, keep her safe. Lord, don't take her yet. Lord, let me get there in time." Time. That was the word that haunted him. When he arrived at Graceland, the house felt wrong, too quiet, too tense. Family members glanced at him with a mixture of relief and dread. He asked one question, "How is she?" and no one wanted to answer. He didn't stay long. He drove straight to the hospital. The moment he stepped through the doors, something in him tightened. Hospitals always smelled like endings. He hated that smell. He hated the echo of footsteps, the low beeping of machines, the hushed voices. He hated that the people he passed looked at him with sympathy instead of joy. But when he walked into her room, all the noise in his mind fell away. There she was, fragile but conscious. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, a spark of life flickering through the exhaustion. Elvis sat beside her, took her hand, and for a moment, it felt like he was 10 years old again, sitting in the little Memphis apartment after school, listening to her hum gospel songs while she cooked. He talked softly. She smiled weakly. He told her he loved her more than anything. She whispered that she knew. But beneath the tenderness was something unspoken. Fear. He saw it in her eyes. She saw it in his. And when visiting hours were over, that fear followed him down the hallway. He returned to Graceland to rest, or at least to lie still and pretend he was resting. Family members hovered, neighbors dropped off casseroles, the phone rang non-stop, fans sent prayers and cards. Graceland, normally filled with music and laughter, had become a staging ground for grief that hadn't yet arrived. But the real tension existed inside Elvis himself. There were things he couldn't say out loud. How he felt guilty for not being home. How he wondered if fame had taken too much from her. How every success he earned seemed to pull him farther away from the woman who made him who he was. And there was another burden, one he carried since birth. He had been born a twin. Only one survived. And because of that, because of Jesse's absence, Gladys held Elvis with a kind of protective fierceness that shaped him entirely. She believed he was a miracle. He believed she was the reason he survived. That bond wasn't mother and son. It was lifeline and heartbeat. And now that heartbeat was fading. On Wednesday, August 13th, Elvis returned to the hospital early. Doctors gave him updates, the fever, the weakness, the inconsistency of her condition, but none of it made sense to him. Medical terms blurred together. All he cared about was the way her hand felt in his. Warm. then cool, then warm again. He prayed each time he felt a change. Outside the hospital room, whispers traveled down the hall. Reporters waited for news. Fans gathered near Graceland. Memphis felt like it was holding its breath. Inside, Elvis felt something else, a quiet panic rising in his chest. Every time a nurse entered the room, he braced himself. Every time a monitor beeped, his heart skipped. But that evening, something unexpected happened. Her fever eased. Her breathing steadied. Her voice grew a little stronger. For the first time in days, Elvis felt hope. He kissed her forehead. He told her he'd be back early in the morning. He told her to rest, to stay strong, to wait for him. And she whispered something, a soft, fragile sentence that brushed against his ear. A sentence that would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. Then he left, believing he still had time. He didn't. And the world Elvis walked out of that night was not the same one he walked into the next morning. Night falls differently when someone you love is in a hospital bed. The world outside moves on, loud and careless, but inside the quiet halls of Methodist Hospital, every second stretches, every whisper echoes, every footstep feels like a warning. For Elvis, August 13th melted into the early hours of the 14th, with a heaviness he could not shake. The hope he felt earlier, that tiny spark when his mother's fever briefly dipped, kept flickering inside him like a stubborn candle refusing to go out. He clung to it. He needed it. He wasn't ready to imagine life without her. He wasn't built for that kind of loss. But hope, especially the fragile kind, has a way of breaking when you grip it too tightly. After leaving the hospital, Elvis returned to Graceland, but the mansion didn't feel like home. The lights seemed too bright. The silence felt too thick. Vernon tried to reassure him, repeating the same phrases over and over. "She's strong, son. She's a fighter. Try to get some rest." But Elvis couldn't rest. He lay in his room staring at the ceiling, feeling something he couldn't quite explain, a kind of internal unraveling. His thoughts spun around the same question. What if the improvement wasn't real? What if it was just the last flicker before the flame went out? Something inside him whispered that he should go back to the hospital. Something inside him begged. But he ignored it. Not because he didn't care, but because hope can be blinding. He wanted to believe she was safe long enough for him to catch his breath. Outside Graceland, cars slowed to a crawl. Fans gathered with candles and handwritten notes. The local press circled like moths around a porch light, waiting for confirmation of the whispers slipping through hospital walls. Elvis's mother very ill. Elvis seen rushing through Methodist Hospital. Condition uncertain. Inside the house, every person moved a little softer, spoke a little quieter. No one dared to break the fragile emotional balance holding the family together. But Elvis, he felt like he was splitting in two. Part of him was Private Presley, the soldier expected to follow orders, stay strong, and finish his duty. The other part was the boy who still called his mother baby in private moments, the boy who once cried in her lap after school when the world felt too big. He longed to collapse into that childhood safety again. But childhood had long since faded. And the man he'd become, the icon, the star, the symbol, felt utterly useless in a hospital hallway. Around midnight, the phone rang, not loud, not urgent, just wrong. Vernon answered. Elvis sat up immediately, watching his father's face shift from confusion to concern. The hospital wanted them to know. Her condition wasn't deteriorating, but it wasn't improving anymore either. A plateau. A silent warning. Elvis felt that strange internal tug again, the pull telling him he needed to go back. Now, immediately. But Vernon, trying to protect his son's thinning spirit, said, "Son, get a few hours of sleep. She'll want to see you rested in the morning." It sounded reasonable. It sounded fatherly. It sounded comforting. It also wasn't true. While Elvis tried to lie still in his bed at Graceland, the hospital room changed tone. Gladys's breathing grew more labored, not dramatic, not sudden, just slightly heavier, slightly deeper, slightly off rhythm, enough for a trained nurse to notice. Her fever crept upward again, climbing like a slow, stubborn tide. Her pulse weakened. Her skin cooled. She drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering fragments of prayers, phrases from old gospel hymns, bits of conversations she seemed to be recalling from years ago. Nurses exchanged looks. Doctors were paged. Charts were checked twice, then a third time. Something was happening, something subtle but irreversible. Her body was slipping. But no call was made yet, not until they were certain. And by the time they were certain, the window was closing. Back at Graceland, Elvis stirred restlessly. He dreamed of the little shotgun house in Tupelo, the one-room space where his mother used to rock him during storms, singing to drown out the thunder. He dreamed of her voice. Then suddenly, that voice went silent. He jolted awake. The room was dark, too dark. He couldn't hear anything, no footsteps, no voices, nothing but the dull pounding of his own heart. He checked the clock. It was early. Too early for visiting hours. Too early for news. But something felt wrong. A pressure in his chest. A chill down his arms. A heaviness behind his eyes. He sat up and ran his hands through his hair as if trying to shake off a nightmare. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it worsened. At the hospital, Gladys's vitals worsened. Her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat thinned. The medical team made the decision. Call the Presley family. No. A nurse picked up the phone. A doctor stood behind her, watching, waiting. When Vernon answered, her voice was steady but gentle. You and your son need to come immediately. Not soon. Not when you can. Immediately. Vernon didn't repeat the exact phrasing. He couldn't. He walked to Elvis's room and opened the door slowly, as if hesitant to step into the darkness he was bringing with him. Elvis, they want us at the hospital. Just like that. Simple words. Terrifying meaning. Elvis felt the air leave his lungs. He was already out of bed. Already pulling on shoes. Already moving before he could think. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Something inside him already knew. The car ride was silent. Not peaceful. Not calm. Silent like a scream held underwater. Elvis stared out the window, replaying every moment of the last few days. Her smile when he walked into her room. The way she squeezed his hand. The flicker of hope the evening before. The sentence she whispered when he said goodnight. He couldn't shake that sentence. He wouldn't reveal it for years. But it was the kind of sentence that burrows into your soul. The kind of sentence that sounds like goodbye even if it isn't spoken that way. When they arrived, Elvis didn't wait for his father. He didn't wait for directions. He ran. Down the hall. Past the waiting room. Past nurses who tried to stop him politely. He ran because something inside him was screaming. You're too late. When he reached the hallway outside room 107, a doctor stepped forward. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way meant for television. Just a quiet, resigned step, the kind that doctors make when they're about to deliver a truth they wish they didn't have to carry. Elvis. The name alone made his stomach drop. The doctor continued, softer. She's fadding. Fadding. Not gone yet. But slipping. Elvis pushed past him into the room. What he saw inside felt like a nightmare made real. Gladys lay still, her skin pale beneath the white hospital sheets. Her breathing was shallow, the slow, soft exhale of someone halfway between worlds. The monitor beeped in an uneven rhythm, each sound softer than the last. Elvis rushed to her side, grabbed her hand and whispered, "Mama, I'm here, please stay with me." He kissed her forehead. He stroked her hair. He begged. But begging doesn't stop time. Not even for the most famous man in America. Not even for the boy who still believed miracles were possible. Her gaze fluttered. Her lips parted. She tried to speak. Only a breath came out. And then, the monitors slowed. Nurses moved closer. Vernon entered quietly, his face twisted with helplessness. In a matter of minutes, the beeps separated, then spaced out further, until there was no pattern left. Just silence. A nurse checked her pulse. A doctor nodded solemnly. The world shifted, and Elvis felt something inside him tear open, a sensation so sharp, so deep, so catastrophic that he couldn't breathe through it. His mother, the only person who had ever known the real Elvis Presley, was gone. Elvis didn't collapse. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He leaned in close, pressed his forehead against hers, and whispered something no one else heard. Something raw. Something heartbreaking. Something that would define him for the rest of his life. Something we reveal in the next section. There in that hospital room, in the quiet before the world found out, Elvis Presley changed forever. Grief doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in quietly, slowly, like a cold fog filling every corner of a room. But for Elvis Presley, grief didn't seep. It struck like lightning. The moment the doctor whispered, "I'm sorry," something inside him broke, not cracked, not bruised, but broke, in a way no human being is ever truly prepared for. For a few seconds, the world went silent. Not the kind of dramatic silence people describe in movies, the soft, cinematic hush. This silence hurt. This silence pressed against his eardrums. This silence felt like punishment. He stared at his mother's face, the stillness of it, the unnatural calm. Her skin was cool, her eyelids gently closed, as if she was simply resting. He waited for her chest to rise. It didn't. He waited for her fingers to twitch. They didn't. He waited for her to whisper his name, even faintly. She didn't. And something inside him whispered the truth he refused to believe. She's gone. Elvis pressed his hand against his mouth, as if trying to hold back a sound he didn't want the world to hear, a sound he didn't know he was capable of making. But the sound came anyway. A broken, muffled cry. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just human. Painfully human. He leaned in, trembling, and pressed his forehead to hers the way he did as a child when he'd run to her after nightmares. He took her hand, the same hand that once tucked him into bed, the same hand that guided him through the crowds of Tupelo, the same hand that held him when he didn't feel strong, and he whispered the sentence he had carried his entire life. A sentence shaped by his birth. A sentence shaped by guilt. A sentence shaped by love. "Mama, I'm sorry I lived, and Jesse didn't." He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Because that was the core of it, the secret he never spoke aloud. He always believed he survived for her. He believed Jesse's absence meant he owed her everything. And now that she was gone, he didn't know who he was supposed to be anymore. He buried his face against her hand, whispering one last time, "I needed you, Mama, I still need you." The room held that confession like a sacred secret. No cameras. No reporters. No audience. Just a son grieving the person who had loved him before the world ever knew his name. Vernon Presley wasn't a perfect man. He wasn't always steady, wasn't always confident, wasn't always sure of his place in the world. But he had always loved his wife. When he walked into the room and saw Elvis leaning over Gladys's still form, something inside him seemed to fold in on itself. His shoulders curled inward. His knees weakened. He reached for the betrayal like a man losing balance. He whispered her name once, twice, as if repetition could undo reality. The roles reversed instantly. Elvis, still breaking himself, tried to hold his father. Two grieving men clinging to each other in a hospital room, too small for the pain it now contained. For a moment, they stood together. Father and son, husband and son, two men who owed their lives to the same woman. But even together, the weight was crushing. Eventually, a nurse gently said they needed to step out while the body was prepared. Elvis didn't want to leave, didn't want to walk out of that room, didn't want the door to close between them. He kept looking back, as if expecting her to move, to smile, to call out his name the way she did when he was little. But she remained still. When the door finally clicked shut behind him, the sound hit him harder than any applause, any criticism, any headline, any heartbreak he had ever endured. That small click, that tiny mechanical sound, felt like the last door closing on his childhood. He walked down the hallway like a ghost. Nurses watched silently. Doctors looked down out of respect. Every footstep felt heavier. By the time he reached the parking lot, his legs felt numb. Graceland had always been his sanctuary, the place he bought not for status, but to keep his parents close, to give them a home worthy of what they gave him. But when he stepped through the front door after the hospital, the house felt cold. Not physically cold, emotionally cold. Empty in a way that chilled the soul. Every room felt altered. Every hallway felt wrong. Every corner seemed to whisper memories. Gladys humming in the kitchen. Gladys calling his name down the stairs. Gladys laughing softly when he'd tell her about a show. Gladys smoothing his hair, telling him he worked too hard. He walked into her bedroom and froze. Her shoes were still by the bed. Her robe still draped over the chair. Her favorite Bible still open on her nightstand. He sat on the edge of her bed and pressed his fingers to his lips, like he was sealing a prayer. Family members gathered. Friends arrived. Neighbors tried to offer comfort. But Elvis couldn't process any of it. People spoke to him, but their words sounded distant, muffled, like voices underwater. What could they possibly say? How could anyone understand the implosion happening inside him? He didn't just lose his mother. He lost the person he trusted more than anyone else. The person who believed in him before he believed in himself. The person who gave him the courage to step on a stage for the first time. The grief wasn't just sadness. It was disorientation, a shaking of the very foundation his life had been built on. Word spread quickly through Memphis. By sunrise, news had reached radio stations. By noon, reporters crowded outside Graceland. Photographs were taken. Headlines were written. Speculation spread like wildfire. One rumor cut deeper than the others. Elvis was in Germany when his mother died. A lie, but it hurt, because even the rumor suggested something unthinkable, that he hadn't been there, that he hadn't made it in time. He had made it. He had held her hand. He had whispered goodbye. But rumors don't care about facts. Rumors feed on emotion. And Elvis, raw and vulnerable, felt the sting of every whisper. People meant well. They sent flowers, cards, prayers. But the avalanche of attention only made the loss sharper, louder, more suffocating. The funeral preparations began immediately. Elvis helped choose the hymns. Not the songs radio would expect, but the ones Gladys used to sing during quiet evenings, melodies layered with faith and tenderness. When the day arrived, hundreds gathered. Fans pressed against gates. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. Elvis didn't want any of it. He wanted 5 minutes alone with his mother. 5 minutes without the world watching. But fame doesn't pause for grief. During the service, he stood stiffly beside Vernon, his jaw clenched so tight he could barely breathe. He listened to the music, to the prayers, to the sobs of strangers who claimed they knew how he felt. But they didn't know. They couldn't know. When he touched her casket, his fingers trembled. His vision blurred. His breath hitched. "I love you, Mama," he whispered. A whisper nearly lost beneath the sound of distant cameras. Weeks after the funeral, he was ordered back to Fort Hood. The army didn't wait for grief. The army didn't make exceptions for sorrow. He hugged his father. He hugged family members. He walked through Graceland one last time before leaving. And when he stepped outside the house, he felt something he didn't expect. Fear. Fort Hood meant discipline. Fort Hood meant silence. Fort Hood meant long days with too much time to think. He rode back to the base, carrying a weight no uniform could lighten. His fellow soldiers greeted him softly. "You okay, Presley?" He nodded. But the nod was a lie. Because how do you recover from losing the person who shaped your soul? At night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing her voice in the back of his mind, the lullabies, the prayers, the gentle warnings. And grief, relentless as a storm, kept pounding at him. People would later say Elvis changed after 1958. They weren't wrong, but they misunderstood the reason. It wasn't fame. It wasn't the army. It was Hollywood. It was the absence, the quiet, the emptiness in the hallways of Graceland, the lost warmth of a voice that once steadied him, the absence of the only person who made him feel safe in a world that demanded more of him every year. His generosity grew because he feared losing anyone else he loved. His giving became compulsive, almost ritualistic, as if surrounding himself with gratitude could keep loneliness at bay. He clung to friends, to the inner circle, to those he trusted even when they failed him. He stopped tolerating certain kinds of silence. He filled rooms with people, noise, gifts, movement. Because quiet reminded him of her room the morning she died. Quiet hurt too much. On the outside, the world still saw Elvis Presley, the star, the phenomenon, the myth. But inside, he was still that boy in room 107. Still holding her hand. Still whispering apologies no one else understood. Still asking why he survived when his twin didn't. Still wondering how to live in a world where she didn't exist. Her death didn't end a chapter. It ripped his story in half. And the man who walked into the next decade, the man the world worshipped, was carrying a wound that never truly healed. A wound that shaped every song, every decision, every heartbreak, every comeback. A wound that would follow him to the very end. Because the truth is simple and devastating. Elvis Presley never stopped being the boy who needed his mother. And without Gladys, he was never the same again. People think grief fades with time. They imagine it softens at the edges, becomes easier to carry, blends into the background of daily life until it's just another shadow among many. But that's not what happened to Elvis Presley. If anything, the years after his mother's death only deepened the wound. It didn't fade, it didn't soften, it didn't disappear. It transformed him. Because the loss of Gladys wasn't just a family tragedy. It was the fault line that split his life into two eras. The boy who lived for his mother, and the man who wandered without her. Everything he became after August 1958, every success, every mistake, every reinvention, carried the fingerprints of a grief he never learned to put down. When Elvis returned to Fort Hood after the funeral, the world expected him to be a soldier again, to follow orders, to train, to blend in, to move on. But he walked back into that base like a man wearing clothes that didn't belong to him anymore. Everyone around him noticed it, a quietness in his posture, a heaviness behind his eyes, a stillness that replaced the energetic warmth they once associated with him. He completed his drills. He showed up on time. He followed regulations to the letter. But his spirit wasn't in it. At night, lying on a thin military mattress, he stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the silence of the barracks, a silence so unfamiliar, so unforgiving, that it pressed on him like a weight. He used to call home often just to hear her voice. Now the phone line felt like a reminder of all he could no longer reach. His father answered sometimes, a hollow attempt at normalcy. But Vernon was grieving too, learning how to breathe again in a house where Gladys's presence still lingered in every room. Every call was a reminder. They were two men trying to navigate the same emptiness from different distances. When Elvis was later deployed to Germany, the newspapers framed it as a new chapter, a maturing moment, a chance for him to grow away from the chaos of fame. But Germany was quieter. Too quiet. And in that quiet, grief became louder. He filled his time with new routines, martial drills, late-night conversations with fellow soldiers, careful attempts to rebuild a sense of normalcy. He met people who would shape his life in the years to come, including members of the circle that eventually became his second family. Some brought comfort, others brought complications. But even as new friendships blossomed, a part of him remained emotionally anchored to a hospital room in Memphis, to the whispered apology he could never take back. Germany didn't give him closure. It gave him space to feel the full weight of what he had lost. In the years that followed, Elvis's relationships took on a new intensity. He didn't just welcome people into his life. He held onto them with a desperation that those closest to him sometimes struggled to understand. He showered friends and strangers with gifts, cars, jewelry, houses, money, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because generosity had become his language of survival. Giving made him feel like he still had control over something. Giving allowed him to keep people close. Giving ensured no one would drift away the way life had taken his mother. To many, it looked extravagant. To some, foolish. But to Elvis, it was simple. If he loved someone, he needed them to feel it. He needed them to stay. Gladys's death hadn't taught him to let go. It taught him to hold on with everything he had. When Elvis returned home from his service, Graceland felt different. It was still beautiful, still filled with music and laughter, still bustling with the energy of family and friends. But the heart of the house was missing. He avoided her bedroom for months. Sometimes he'd pause outside the door, resting his hand on the frame, as if trying to sense her presence through the wood. One family member remembered walking past late one night and seeing him sitting alone on the staircase, staring into the dark. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. He was just sitting, as if caught between two worlds. The world where she lived, and the world where he now had to learn to live without her. He carried that limbo into everything he did. People often wonder why Elvis returned to gospel so consistently throughout his career, not just performing it, but pouring himself into it with a rawness that even his rock and roll performances never matched. The explanation is heartbreakingly simple. Gospel was the last sound connecting him to his mother. Those hymns weren't just melodies, they were memories. They were the soundtrack of his childhood, the songs she hummed while cooking, the hymns she sang when bills piled up, the prayers she whispered when fear crept into their lives. Singing gospel wasn't an artistic choice. It was a conversation with her. When Elvis recorded How Great Thou Art, the emotion wasn't performance, it was grief dressed in harmony. When he sang He Touched Me, it wasn't for the audience, it was for the woman who taught him how to pray. Every gospel note carried her voice inside it. Every harmony was a reaching out. Every lyric was a bridge to the past. His most profound performances weren't concerts. They were confessions. People have long debated why Elvis' career went through periods of frustration, the Hollywood years, the contracts, the creative restrictions. But rarely do they connect the dots. After losing Gladys, Elvis became obsessed, quietly, inwardly, with reclaiming something in his life he could control. He couldn't control death. He couldn't control grief. He couldn't control time. But he could control a stage. He could control a song. He could control the emotions pouring out of him when the lights hit his face. His fiercest battles in the 60s, the moments when he pushed back against creative limitations, the longing for a musical rebirth, weren't just artistic frustrations. They were attempts to rebuild the inner compass he lost in 1958. When he stepped on stage for the 1968 comeback special, the world saw a star reclaiming his throne. But underneath the leather suit and electric energy was something more. A man finally speaking again after 10 years of emotional silence. People often talk about Elvis's romances, the intensity, the passion, the fragility, without understanding the psychology behind them. He loved deeply. He loved intensely. He loved with the urgency of someone afraid of losing again. And yet, he held a part of himself back, a part of himself that never fully healed. He protected that part fiercely. Not even wives or girlfriends ever reached the place inside him where Gladys lived. How could they? They weren't meant to replace her, but the world expected them to fill her role. They couldn't. No one could. So he loved, yes, but always with an invisible wall built from August 1958. After Gladys's death, father and son leaned on each other in ways neither expected. Vernon had lost his wife. Elvis had lost his anchor. Together, they tried to rebuild a new life, awkwardly at times, painfully at others. They weren't always aligned. They didn't always understand each other. But grief tied them together like two men clinging to the same piece of driftwood in a rough sea. Elvis became more protective of his father. Vernon became more dependent on his son. It wasn't perfect, but it was survival. Gladys Presley wasn't famous. She didn't stand in the spotlight. She didn't perform on stage. But her presence shaped the man who became a global phenomenon. And her absence shaped the legend he ultimately became. Elvis's charisma came from her kindness. Elvis's humility came from her teachings. Elvis's generosity came from her example. Elvis's spiritual hunger came from her faith. Elvis's vulnerability came from her protection. Elvis's grief came from losing her too soon. The world remembers Elvis Presley as a king. But kings are human. Kings carry wounds. Kings break quietly in rooms no one sees. And the truth beneath the myth is simple. Elvis never stopped trying to fill the space his mother left behind. Every gift he gave, every gospel song he recorded, every longing look into the audience, every late-night session at Graceland, every quiet moment alone, was a man searching for a voice he could no longer hear. Gladys Presley didn't just shape his beginning. She shaped his ending, his choices, his fears, his brilliance, his loneliness, his tenderness, his legend. And in the meditation garden at Graceland, where mother and son now rest side by side, the story finally finds its full circle. Not closure, not resolution, but peace. A place where the boy from Tupelo and the mother who raised him can finally share the quiet together again.